event of our series Design the Future. So a series of lectures about architecture, about landscapes, oriented to describe this mutable condition of the emergency we are living through. Today I'm giving the introduction of to the lecturer, Lina Gottme. We are very glad to have you at our series, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Sara Protasoni cannot be with us today for some health problems. For sure, she's giving Lina her greetings, and we are sure we can have a fantastic tonight lecture. So now I'm giving the floor to Lina, then we have a small discussion as in the format of our event. So just a brief about Lina's biography and the reason, because we have decided to ask her to join our panel, our discussion. We were in the middle. I was saying to Lina before opening this lecture, we were in the middle of our lockdown, and I was reading the Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, I think you know, and I have found an interview with Lina about the places for coronavirus moment and so on. I was very impressed by the article, and so I decided to look a bit more about her experience, and so we have decided to invite her definitely, because what she's doing with her office, her firm in Paris is very, very interesting, I guess, also for our program, also for our master, because she's working strongly on the threshold and limits between architecture and landscape, and she's experimenting and innovating a lot in the field of design. You can see her screen, and the title of the lecture is very topical for the moment we are discussing, for archaeology of the future, and it's exactly in this idea that every architectural action, every architectural strategist comes from the traces of the past that maybe, I guess, Italian and French, European culture is. This approach that now Lina is explaining us during this lecture come also from a very complex, a very interesting and very deep personal experience of Lina itself. She's from Beirut, she's from Lebanon, so where she also started her studies in architecture. Then she moved to France, to Paris. She worked in Paris, she worked in London together with some key figure of our European culture, such as Jean Nouvel, Norman Foster, and so on. So the internationality we are experiencing through our master in our campus of the Scienze of Politecnico in Milano is a multiculturality dimension that the biography of Lina Gottme is completely representing, is communicating us. And this internationality and multiculturality is also in the office we are seeing in the background of Lina's faces, because there are a lot of Italians there. So I guess for Lina is the second time at Politecnico Milano. She was giving a lecture maybe 12 or 13 years ago. So it's a very pleasure for us to host you at Politecnico. I want to just to say the last thing, so about archaeology of the future, multiculturality, internationalization, but also the multiple and changeable limits and conditions between architecture and landscape. In the poster we have done, for Sara has done for this lecture, you can see one of the last projects by Lina, the competition they won for the Hermes workshop building in Normandy. Now they are starting to build it. And I guess in this image, in this superimposition, overlapping of different elements, you can read what architecture and the landscape is in these multiple frontiers and limits. And I guess this is one of the dimensions we need also to work mostly in this situation we are living through. So I'm not leaving you more time. Now you have. I'm giving you the floor. I still thank you very much for your presence here. We are almost 60, but tonight I guess we need to arrive to 100 participants to this event. So Lina, it's your turn, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michele, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you for taking the time to introduce and to talk about the philosophy of my practice. Thank you also, Sarah. I hope we can meet again, and I hope also I can come to see you all very soon in Milano. I'm always very excited to meet the students in person and the people who are in the audience. So it's definitely tougher to do a lecture like this, but yeah, I'm really looking forward for the interaction at the end. As you explained, I mean, I will try to explain to you how we do our architecture and what's the philosophy behind the making. And the idea of the archaeology of the future is this relationship between the history and between the past and how we project from the past new futures and what we learn actually from our past. So the studio is really research driven, and this is what you saw as in a photo in the beginning, this kind of walls of research, of finding, of digging actually every time we do a project. There's also a lot of work by the hand, even if today we are facing technology and we have all the tools to develop three-dimensional modeling. We definitely use these, but we think the hand has a very important part in the making of architecture. The hand as drawing, but also as fabricating, as making errors also when you construct. So the error is part of the process of making, and it gets you also closer to the materiality. And the culture is also one important thing. So we are a team of almost 25 people from all over the world, with a majority of Italians, because you are very good workers and creatives as well. Maybe this is why we have a lot of Italian in the office. And the whole process, as I say, it's about the search from the history and questioning. So every project is a question rather than directly an answer, moving from the history of the hut to the tower, to basically what happens beneath the ground. It's not only about building, but it's also about looking at history. So I like this image, for example, of this city that was discovered in Turkey, and suddenly you don't know what's the limit between Earth and between the city that we discovered. So the complete fusion also of architecture with the place from which it emerges. It's not only about contextuality in the sense of having a contextual building, but it's really about also having an environmental building project that emerges from its context as a finding, rather than just like an object that is positioned in the context. And as you introduced, Michele, it's true that this maybe idea of the archaeology emerges from what I've seen in Beirut. I grew in Beirut during the war, and I've seen the city completely destroyed, and have seen all the time, every time there's a new building, like this process of digging. And every time we dig in Beirut, we discover the history of the city. We see how it was before, and how how it was buried 7 times throughout its history. And it questions every time this act of building again. And then we see also nature coming over this ruin and coming like just to invade this ruin of war or of history, whether it's a Roman bath that we discover or a Greek history underground. Nature comes and really brings happy, like another image to architecture. It gives it positivity, even if it's the outcome of a war, it becomes a positive environment. So it has an importance to it, not only as a tool or as a medium that we have to respect our environment and work with it, but it also ensures a well-being in our context. So for us, architecture is positioned between archaeology, between the future, between what is humane and what is nature. Archaeology, because it's about digging, humane because it's inclusive, nature as a nurturing act, and future as a finding. And every pole brings other words to it. So it's not only actually about making ecological architecture, it's really making ecological architecture that respects nature, that is also humane. So it includes the hand, the craft, and society in its making. It talks to its past and projects into the future because it has a technology. It also dialogues with innovation. It has an originality to it. It has an excitement to this new space that we create. So in a way, we see architecture as a body. It's really rather than just an object that is inanimate. It's really an animate body. It has a life to it. It breathes with its context, and it should be sustainable in a way. So it's a body that is very much rooted. And in that sense, this kind of idea allows us actually, whether we work on a museum scale or we work on an installation, to think about the process of architecture in the same manner. So in the sense, like here, we look at this photo of this museum that I started my practice in 2006 with. And I wanted to show you because this is a museum that we established in Estonia that was a competition open for all architects to intervene. And this was the launching pad for me as a first project to establish my practice. And I was only 26 then, so that was in 2006. So it's also a kind of encouragement for all young architects and students to really explore the world, to just understand our environment and go do things. So this is a building that is in continuity with a military airfield that exists in Tartu, which is the cultural capital of Estonia. And the building we proposed, back then I was with two other architects, and we proposed this continuity with the airfield, and the building comes and becomes a place for the nation. And now it's built. It houses all the culture of Estonia, and it's really linked with their history and becomes a cultural incubator. So moving from that scale into really the scale of the installation. And here you can see an installation that we recently delivered in Tokyo. So this is a hotel that is a very prestigious one. And we really here we're doing a model where we test this micro scale of the lighting. So, and then the result is this lighting installation that is at the entrance of one of the restaurants. And the idea here was to bring the history of Versailles, because in this restaurant, it's a French restaurant in Tokyo. So the question was how to bring a French touch into a French restaurant in Tokyo. So bringing Versailles into that context. So this kind of intercultural also crossing between France, with Tokyo, and how to bring a trace from cultural understanding of another country into the other and give it in a space or in an object. So moving from there to this installation, to in the same place also this like vertical installation that reflects on the wisteria flower, that is also a very let's say typological flower of that hotel. And then again, here we move to the larger scale, which is that of interiors. And here we have an apartment in Paris, an Osmanian apartment, and keeping the spirit of the existing and giving it a modernity, giving it a sense of newness to it. So always working with the existing and at the same time like dialoguing and giving a new language to it. So within that process, we move from the museum scale to the object scale towards also the scenography. So this is an exhibition design that is set in Tokyo. So it is in the National Museum of Tokyo, and it was an exhibition design for 15 master artists that were exhibited in the National Museum of Tokyo, and they were French, and we brought their objects to be exhibited there. So it's all about this notion of the light and the shadow. And if you read the book of Tanizaki and The Praise of Shadow, so it's really telling the story of the conception, the Japanese conception of light, and that was also part of the inspiration for this exhibition, how to dialogue with light and bring this black and white color and mood around the objects that are exhibited. So I wanted to show you in the beginning like a series of projects that are more telling the approach of the office and the variety of scales that an architect can deal with, always in mind the same methodology of work or the same process. So again here with the same type of work, this scenography of artwork that we did in Tokyo, and moving from that to work with material like glass casting, for example. Here, this is a boutique for a chocolate maker that just finished in France, and 2 years ago actually. And it's like a box of like a three-dimensional sculpture that you get in, and all the glass is cast, handmade, and inserted in these kind of shapes. So the idea being that the boutique of chocolate becomes almost a museum for chocolates, and it becomes an immersive experience of sculpting. Because also the chocolate maker is a sculptor. He makes these huge chocolate sculptures that you see in the photo. So really blurring the boundary of typology as well. What is a boutique? What is a museum? And how can we cross the typologies to create something new and kind of innovative experience in every project? To a smaller scale, this like a workshop that I did in the south of France, in Bois-Boucher. So here, if you also are interested, they do a lot of very nice workshops in the south of France in a domain that is established by the founder of Vitra. And they invite every 2 years architects, designers to work with amateurs of design, but also with students, and build a structure in 5 days. So we just did this in 5 days, and it's a greenhouse that portrays the idea of growth, because it's growing crops within it. So this idea of a growth is portrayed in the shape of this installation that we made in model first to test its presence. And it was established in just really close to another installation by Shigeru Ban that you see at the end of the image, and next to a castle that is conserved in this area. And then we just built it in 5 days. It's a simple wooden structure, and it shows also that architecture construction, it's a collaborative process, and how we can build by hand and emerge a structure together. And then after became an event in itself. So it's also about showing the blur between architecture and landscape, and even here at a scale of an interior. This is an interior design that for Palais Tokyo, and this is a restaurant. If you've been to Paris, it is set in the Museum of Palais Tokyo, which is a museum of contemporary art. And here the idea of the landscape emerges with these lights, actually, that I drew, and that they are suspended within that space. And how to create within one environment this different scales of moods and of light. But also the challenge here was to move into the design of the object, and to really design the bar, for example. This is a counter here, and it's all about also ecology and sustainable materials. So we designed like a large rammed earth bar. So I drew all the bar and then manufactured it with an Austrian like specialist of earth, and also the whole question of earth comes from the notion of food, like tracing food and the relation that making us remember that basically what you eat comes from the ground, comes from earth, actually, and this is an important material that we need to use, and it's a sustainable material that can constitute our built environment. So from here, moving to other sustainable material like the wood, and constructing all the chairs, and then orchestrating this large space of the restaurant with the lights to create moments of intimacy. And then again, this kind of same approach with a larger, let's say, building that we are leading at the moment in Tours. This is like an hour away from Paris, and we're doing the choreographic center. So it's a dance center. And the whole idea is how to bring the dance into the urban environment. So to open up actually the whole dance experience into the city. So opening its whole, and at the same time also reflecting on a building that dances itself in its shape, because it draws on the history of the city and all these traditional buildings that are juxtaposed in the city center, and that also inspire the shape of the building itself. And within it, you discover all the dance halls and allow the experience to develop within the interior of the building. From there, also, like the notion of earth and of belonging to the ground is also explored in Lebanon, and this is a project for like a winery, and we are in like a vineyard, and in the deepest fault actually of seismic fault in Lebanon. So this is the map of Lebanon, and what you see here is really the site of that project, and it's really set in this very deep seismic fault. So we had to, the idea was to really make this building belong to earth, belong to the ground itself, and make it emerge as a line that just takes the lines of the vineyard and make them grow vertically. So moving from here, I'd like to focus on like more some projects and explain more in-depthly actually the process through these projects. So the first one, and I will present 3 projects, and the first one is a building that I designed in Beirut, and this is a building that really relates very much to my birth city and what I lived in there, because of course I lived with this city that is war-torn, with all the bulleted facades because of the war. So, and at the same time, this is what made me become an architect, because it's also this desire to build and to transform a negative memory into a positive one. And when it came to this project, that is set on the port of Beirut, so it's really close to the city center, but towards the port area. I had to ask many questions, because at some point we are faced with a city that is built upon itself, where you can see here in this photo the old tiled roof of the city of Beirut here. And sometimes these towers that are just developers' towers that are reproducing the same apartment over and over. And then some like designers just being able to express themselves within that landscape. So asking oneself, what can be a building today? What could be a building that expresses the memory of the city, even if it's a housing project? Okay, so this is a housing project, but at the same time, it had to express the memory of the city. So I was very much inspired by these also buildings that you see, this old house where the nature comes in and just invades the building. And what you see here is the site of the project, this like large hall before the emergence of the construction. And the site of the project itself, as you see here, this building here that is written Dervish Haddad on it, this was the first established concrete factory in Beirut. So I was faced with that existing building, and where one famous architect has his office as well, but it was meant to be demolished. So at the same time, demolishing that building was an act in itself and needed to be present within that building. And the initial client of that project was also a famous French-Lebanese photographer and a friend now, and has taken Beirut during the war. So you could see a lot of photos. He's a photographer. He took Beirut during the war, and you could really see what many of us had lived during that period. So this kind of like eaten up buildings. And but at the same time, they are really giving a new texture in the city. This is like almost an artwork, controversially speaking. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that at one point the building becomes almost a skeleton when looking at it? Although it bears the traces of the war, how can it also become opening for a new architectural language? And also, I was like moving around with my students in Beirut during the study trip, and here you could see the photo of one famous building that was used as a sniper's area, and that was really on the limit between Beirut East and West, where the all the conflicts happen. And at the same time had this very strong, spatial quality to it, because of that violence of this opening that created tension of life as well. So all these became an inspiration, actually, and became elements of language to be expressed through that building. Again, this notion of the earth, these are photos that I took of a lot of archaeologies that happen in Beirut. Every time you want to build a new project there, you discover something underground and directly it gets disappeared. So all this had to be expressed for me through that new figure of architecture. How can a residential building become like a portrayer of life, of nature, but also of the history of the city? And you could see also the ruin that you could see when walking along the city, that becomes a place where nature comes, takes its rights. And funnily enough, these are the only places that you could see nature in Beirut. It's really like through these ruins or derelict lands, and you don't have parks, you just see them there. So why not take this language and really re-explore it within the building itself, and having the openings of that facade or the balconies, or the inner balconies, become housing of gardens and of life. And then the process of construction becomes almost the process of destruction. So it's really like the concrete skeleton of the building emerging, questions whether this building had been existent there or it's a new one. So, and this is very interesting moment, very emotional moment, where you don't really know whether the project had already an existence in its place. So it has a spirit in the place where it is set. And the way under construction also, the way it is explored, like the photo here, is really how it will be in the future. And these are only the workers within the building that just put their pots here and just interacted with the building in the same way that is meant to be. And then taking photos inside, could see also the trace of the photographer, because the idea of bringing the city as a photography within the apartment. So the openings become frames that show the city in a new way, and portray it as almost an artwork within the apartment. So on the ground floor of that residential building, there is also like a foundation that is dedicated for photography, and the idea was to keep it in its raw format. So from experiencing photography as a spatial act within the construction or within the structure of the apartments, towards actually having the photography exhibited within the ground floor of that building. And then one important part also was that for me, that building had to emerge from earth. It had to become part of the ground and express this belonging. And that's what you see on its facade, this kind of earthly render that is striated, that is labored, and that becomes part, almost a healing process within the city. And that also had the participation of the artisans, of the workers. So here, really like moving from the tests in the office towards the actual reality of the making of the building. So it was all a process of experimentation on site, trying to chisel that envelope and give it almost a laboring hand that also gives an unstandard take into the building. So it's not anymore, you don't see the joints, you don't see any tiling, any standard element that is manufactured in the factory, but everything is done by the hand and gives a new emotion to architecture. So some of the photos of the inside during construction, how it frames the outside. And I really love the photos during construction time, because maybe it's the memory that I have of Beirut, of this kind of in-between state where it's never finished and it always opens up for imagination. And this is the south facade, where it's just the small opening by almost as if bulleted by the war. Now the latest photos that were taken by Iwan Ban, and you could see the nature, the plantation going through the building. This is the entrance part. and then an experience within the inside where you could see the apartment and the relationship with the planters. So the garden is part of the balcony and creates the filter with the outside and frames actually the city from within. And it assumes itself as almost a monster, you know, like it's just it's a cute monster in the city. It's just like has a specific shape in itself and is sculpted by the urban regulation. So another thing is actually how the question for me is how can we avoid seeing architecture from one angle and being able to capture it immediately. You have to experience it in space to give it a sense. So that's also the point of the building. It's not like a square like edifice or like a tower that you can just grasp in one photo. You really have to go three-dimensionally to experience the building. That approach as well of anchoring a project in its context, we're doing now the urban rehabilitation of the Montparnasse site. So this is in Paris in the 14th, and we're working with the Rogers and Partners from London. And the whole idea of the project is to bring new sustainability for that city scale and for this neighborhood, and to actually in a way heal what we have built some decades ago. We used to build like mega platforms that just like are positioned on the ground and that don't make a building interact with the underneath and with the ground itself. So the whole idea was to open up that site and to bring a new continuity with the street, to bring also an urban forest within that site. So here, like what you see in blue is just an understanding of how people circulate within an area. And we took this mapping of the circulation of people within that urban plot, and we used it to create our openings within that block and to open up actually this like commercial center and make extension of the whole street of Rue de Rennes, which is a commercial street in the 6th of Paris, and bringing it towards the tower. So it's also like how to use the heritage that what we have in the city at the moment to destroy least and to really bring back a human scale into our environments, bringing back nature into a city scale, but also, of course, dealing with the climate change, because like when we have a whole concrete ground, it heats and it creates like a heated area, and it is so essential to bring back nature in these overly minerals places. So this whole challenge of that rehabilitation was about dealing with a history with an existing, doing the least in it so we don't create a lot of waste, but at the same time bringing nature within it and giving a porosity and bringing back that part, that like a piece of the city back to its inhabitants. So again, like with this scale of or like approach of projects with the sustainable, take on projects. I don't know if you heard, like few years from now, in 2016, Paris has launched a large call for innovation, which was Réinventer Paris, and it was calling for doing ecological projects that would not only deal with like sustainable constructions, but also propose functions and programs that are able to deal with the climate change, that also deal with fast evolution of our societies in terms of use, of functions. And they've put, like the city of Paris have put a series of sites that were a bit of a derelict sites actually in the city for competition. And they asked architects to come with the developers, to come with users and propose innovative projects. So that was the first time as architects, we didn't have a program, we didn't have a developer, we didn't have anything. We just had land and we had to go and meet the developer, the financer, the users, and come up with a whole project that works from A to Z, and that is able to, to raise and to materialize in its architecture a response to a challenge. So this project, we chose the site of next to a station in the 13th district. So it's a small lot. It's almost 100 square meters footprint, and it's along the little belt of Paris. So that's the whole, an old railway station that used to cross whole Paris. And we proposed, this is the site actually that you see. So this is the center here of Paris, and this is the 13th. So you could see it's on the edge, of Paris. And there's this old station that is left out, and it used to be like the station that served all this railway here. That is now just a place for nature that is taking over. And moving from there, the idea was to develop a project that is able to deal with the sustainable feeding. So how to, within one place, be able to talk about all the issues of food. Why food? Because it's the first link that we have to Earth. If we eat differently tomorrow, if we think about a closed circuit and a circular economy, in the way we eat locally, we lessen our waste. We also, in a way, foster a different relationship to the planet, but also a much more sustainable way of living. So moving from there, we started imagining a place that is a continuity with the little belt. And here, in a way, this, Archim Boldo painting, like a building that is made of vegetables, that is made of nature. So it became a place that is around food. So a place that we can research, we can innovate, we can share, we can also reuse within that place. So it's also a place for cultivating, for being cultivated, like knowing, and it's about circular economy. So from within that, I started thinking about how to orchestrate a program where you have an urban agriculture, housing, like a place for a chef, and then all of it functioning in a circular economy. And at the same time, also thinking about the construction that is linking to its context, it's continuing the site. And also dealing with and being able to have different aspects with architecture, research, agriculture, the environment. And also, in terms of architecture, instead of going for a vertical stacking of the floors, creating interaction from one level to the other. So started connecting these different floors together and creating a continuous ramp. So the whole building is like a promenade that rises up in the whole building. And nature is part of. So this is a project that I'm leading now in the office, and that is taking a little bit of time, but hopefully will be constructed soon. So you can see also that water is part of circular economy. It's all recycled, reused. the wood is a sustainable one. It's used from eco-forest, local French wood. And as you know, when you're building in wood, it's much more sustainable because we're using like an assembling method of construction. So we're able also to disassemble. So if tomorrow this building is of no use, we can disassemble it and reuse its material also. This also how the question for me was how to bring like the neighbors and like include them as part of the making of that project. So all the interiors will be made along with the neighbors, with the inhabitants around. So here are like some models that we made in the office. So the top of the tower is this like agriculture place that is dedicated for research, and then on the top of that existing station becomes a place dedicated for the public. And here you can see like the housing part. So I took all the arches of the station. They became like the arches that express the facade and the envelope of the building itself. So like some of the like environment here of the outside as well. So the last project, do I have still some time to present the last one, Michele?
Yes, sure.
Okay. This last project that you also talked about, this is a competition that we won in northern of France, in Normandy area, and it's a manufacturing place for Hermès. So here also in terms of sustainable ambition, it's a building that is meant to be a passive building, very low impact on its environment, but that is also have to like express the power of the hand, the precision actually of building. So the idea was how to get inspired really, and from this micro level of the making of the leather craft and the work, and to be able to employ it on the architectural scale. Oops. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and also get inspired from the space or the existing city itself, the like the Normandy area landscape that is very moist one, and to integrate it as part of the architecture. So going from the program, which is that of a very rigorous way of making, and from the place itself, and the let's say the ambition of making a system of architecture, here we drew like a kind of a grid, like a base, let's say, system that composed the architecture of that project. And moving from there, sorry for the blank pages. I don't know what happened. Maybe my teams get tired. Okay. So from the context here, like from that system or from that grid, the question was what material can we bring on, and what kind of material can be also a local material. So here I discovered that actually there are brick manufacturers that are very close to the site of that project. So it was very evident that to use the most local materials. So brick was the choice for that building. So we also reduce our carbon impact. So we source the materials from the closest source possible. But not only for that, it's also about a reflection of that micro scale, how to construct a project that reflects this notion of precision and this micro scale. And when thinking about it, the brick is really forces you actually to draw your architecture to the micro scale, because we had to draw every single brick like my team had to draw all the bricks of the facade and really measure the building according to the brick size, but also according to the imprint of the hand. And funnily enough, the brick is also an expression of the ride of the horse, because when you want to create an opening and create a large span, the easiest span is an arch when you use the brick construction. So it became like an expression also of the trace of the movement of the horse, or the movement of the of that a horse, which is also the purpose of this manufacture. So moving from there, what was very interesting in that project, and many of the projects that we're leading on, in the office, is the complete, let's say, marriage between architecture and technique. And today, to do ecological projects and low impact buildings, we really have to understand the technique and the guts of the project, and to reduce at the same time its need of energy consumption by thinking of smart architecture, like in terms of its setting in the environment, but also of how to use the energy, how to use clean energy instead of using the classical production means. So in that sense, using geothermal energy, reducing the car use and replacing it by electric cars, thinking about producing solar panels to produce the energy needed within that building, but at the same time also thinking about an architecture that brings in nature inside of it, but also is able to be the most compact possible in order to be the least consuming of energy. That is self-ventilated, where nature becomes also a shield for that type of architecture. It protects it, it creates a microclimate within it. So also the brick has a good inertia, so it really protects the building. And then moving from there, giving without losing the aesthetic of a project, being able to at the same time bring nature, bring the environment, energy efficiency, and the technological tool into a primitive, almost primitive type of architecture. Yeah, thank you very much. You can discover more on our social media.
Thank you very much, Lina. It was very brief but deep path and process through your research and through your process, where I guess the complexity of the questions, and also a very integrated approach between different fields, different disciplines, different ways to look at places, such as the photograph views in the first project, or other type of potentials ways to look at, is very interesting. So I guess Sarah is collecting some questions. I guess we had some of them through WhatsApp. Otherwise, other student, professor, and colleagues are requested to join the question in the comments, and maybe critiques, why not, on in the chat, and we can have 20 minutes the final discussion. So Sarah, maybe you can start.
Yeah. Thank you again, Lina, for your lecture. It was very interesting and enlightening, also especially for this question about the sustainability of the design and like going back to the manual way of conceiving a project and so on. I was wondering of a question of my own about like the city we are living in these days. Like it's a bit what we were discussing before the start of the presentation. Like now the city, the public spaces are empty. The life just happens inside the building. And you think like this special occasion will affect the way we think the inside and outside spaces from now on? And if so, the nature will play a more relevant role. I speak about Italy, but nowadays everyone is like planting flowers on their balcony, or having like little green spaces where before there was nothing. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, totally. I think we realize actually that when we are using our internal spaces, like where we're like confined within the apartments, that we definitely need this interaction with the exterior, and mostly we need the interaction with nature. And nature, we realize how nature plays not only a healing, like it has a healing capacity to it. It allows us to be able to become contemplative. It has the capacity to make us more patient, but at the same time, it gives us a notion of time itself, because you can feel time differently. Actually, during that period, I started seeing that the season has changed in a much more like rigorous way that I wouldn't see when we are like just living our daily life, which is very magical. Actually, you really feel time in a slower manner, which is very important as human beings to live through. And I think actually we realize that like what is our intuitive need as humans. So in a sense, it becomes so important to have more porosity to the exterior and to bring the environment within our enclosed spaces, and that the limit between what is private, what is public, is not necessarily a very strict one as we live it today. That it has to be much more negotiated as a limit. It has to allow for more porosity. Then we questioned, we need really our buildings to be that much vertical and that our ground that much horizontal. This has been questioned for a long time, like by many architects in the past decade, but we haven't really, created more porosity between both. And of course, the other question that is raised out of the confinement is the fact that we now work in our homes. So the notion of function and what is the use of our homes is raised. So how can we not only live within our apartments, but are we able also to work within these apartments? Are the apartments able to become more flexible, to allow different qualities of spaces within one very limited square meter? So this kind of superposition of typologies becomes much more relevant to explore today.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also found it like myself in my living conditions, so I can vouch for that. Then now I pass to another question by Riccardo that was addressing the initial statement of your lecture, Archaeology of the Future. It says, this term suggests me, surely forcing your interpretation and intention to ask which of the actual use for the building will be definitely abandoned because of technology, the COVID, use of the spaces is a good promotion, and which typological changing you imagine in the near future. In your opinion, which of actual building will soon become archaeology? How we will transform them?
Yeah, I don't know if I understand completely the question, but it's an interesting question. Like how, it makes me imagine almost like the building becomes half a ruin actually. So it's very nice imagery. But I think like it's interesting to think about our spaces in terms of their quality, rather than only about their use. If we conceive spaces that have certain qualities in terms of their ecological qualities, in terms of their spatial quality, as how they bring light inside, how well you feel inside, these spaces are almost timeless. So you can use them in any way you want. You could use them as housing. You could use them as a museum. You could use them as an office building. So it forces really a kind of a thinking that is not typologically based, but is qualitatively based. So it's not how we consume our spaces as functions where we eat, sleep, draw, or like work, but as the pleasure, as places of pleasure where that invite you to work, that can also invite you to sleep. So let's not build only the housing that are just 2.5 meters high and have museums of 7 meters high only. What about some kind of breathing between both together and allowing this mixity within one whole building?
Yeah, I think about the question, the point was if there are typologies that now are spread it all over the cities, that in the future will become irrelevant because of the social distancing, or like the fact that people tend to stay more inside than outside.
I'm not sure actually that they will become irrelevant, because you know, as humans we're always tempted to interact. So let's say we don't use office buildings anymore, okay, because we have our spaces to work inside. I think they will become places of interaction. You will put a mask. Maybe we will figure out a kind of extension of the body that protects us, but it won't be the case that we don't interact anymore. I don't believe in that actually, because we need that interaction. So we would interact together in a different way. Maybe the offices spaces that we don't use because we discovered that we really mostly work through Teams. Will become places, restaurants, or we become like public places. So in that sense, they can transform, but won't become a derelict place.
Yeah, I totally agree. Then I have another question from Michele. Thank you very much for your very suggestive images and project. You have designed a real museum and other spaces that sound like museum despite of a different main function. Do you think our contemporaneity is developing a new dimension for exhibition areas?
Sorry, I'm gonna read the...
No, it's a question I received on the... Okay. Yeah. The question was about the exhibition spaces of the future. If you think like the fact that now are more complex spaces, they will develop in something different from what we have now.
The exhibit, yeah, I think like one of the things about exhibition spaces, I mean, the question is, why would we go to an exhibition while today we can, you know, discover art and discover, have the knowledge through the net or through, you know, our technological access, immaterial access. I think the point of going to an exhibition is a heightened sense of emotion, is to experience like material, is to heighten our sense in one side. And this is very important. It means that the exhibition spaces becomes experiential, and they become much more immersive, materially immersive places. And in another sense is the need of interaction. These become places where you could be, you have a better interaction that you could not have if you are discovering an artwork or exhibition through technology. So interaction becomes an important part where you are able to understand better a work, where you can really question it. You can discover a knowledge by, you know, scanning work, and then a voice comes in. So you have a physical interaction within an exhibition space.
Perfect. Another question by, sorry for my pronunciation, Xiao Yuan. The question is, The series of renderings are totally amazing. What is the ideal way of representing the architecture ideas in your mind?
I think representation and tools of representation, not only presentation, are very important in the process because they direct the outcome. They direct what you do. So, for me, they should be multiple. So we don't really just work on images. Images are important as much as models, as much as research, sketching. All of these intersect together. But what is very important in our process, for me, is the aesthetic quality, the beauty of every single thing. Like, it is so important that when we do a model, that it's beautiful. When we put a layout or an image, even if it's a process, it has a beauty in it. Because this is what makes it, what allows us to build up actually and reach like a result that is satisfactory. As soon as, sometimes when I was teaching at school, students would just come with an idea and present it like but yeah, it's a process, it's a draft, it's not finished, it's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay. Even if it's draft, it has to be beautiful. It has to beautifully has this kind of emergence in it. So you love it. So you are able to bring on pleasure and continue it and give it a reality.
It's also kind of matter of empathy maybe with your design. Like if you can enjoy it, then it's become more understandable. So for the next question by Martina, again, she thanks you for your lecture. She says, Vittorio Regotti, during an interview I took with him in his home 3 years ago, stated that contamination seems to be a new slogan destined to have a good chance for future. This term, intended within its positive definition, could represent a paradigm for the modification of vacant spaces, both in spatial and linguistic point of view. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's a very relevant comment and question in the sense that all the work that I'm doing is really contaminated. It's it's diverse. I am also contaminated myself because I'm not the product of one culture. I'm the product of many cultures coming from different places and intersected together. So it's really through also this contradiction of different universe that we can emerge something new, that's something more exciting and more relevant in its place, and not being just drawing one limit into the field of architecture and bounding it in its own field, but opening it, creating a porosity in it instead of thinking of architecture as the field of drawing lines. Is really about the field of bringing in relationships and materializing them in space.
This is a nice thought. Another question from Made. Thank you for your presentation. In your housing project, the planting, use of earth, woods, and various scales of openings seem to me invokes naturalness and organic quality of the old town. With growing number of studying, investigating the biophilic quality of historical architecture, what do you think about the possibility of current and future architecture to emulate such quality?
The primitive quality of architecture. It's a very interesting thought because although the process of work, I like the fact that I always question how a building can emulate in its newness an old quality. I think it's also about how we learn from the past. There's lots of intuitive ways of making that we learn in the history of constructing our cities and our built environments. And these are very important because they allow us to understand our inner needs, our spontaneous needs as beings, but also how we can be much more in synergy with our environment. And bringing this kind of very rudimental knowledge and the technology that we have today is really precious at this point of time, because it's really bringing our very basic approach to our environment and the construction and our technology, and being able to push them further. So, for example, let's take earth construction. Today, we are able to develop higher buildings with earth because of technologies, with our capacity of calculating the load-bearing capacities of earth, or even printing with clay. So that brings us back to history, brings us back to initial constructions, but allows us to project them into the future.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Giuseppe Baracchi, that is the representative of the Order of Architects in Piacenza. He says, it's an interesting study approach starting from architectural archaeology, and I find very interesting the buildings in Beirut, with synthesis, personal evaluation between local, historical, and research and technological innovation. With regard to historical reference to the history of architecture, my design idea, and to the master architects, as much as Louis Kahn, is there in the last project presented? Thank you for the presentation. Like, so just to sum up, there are any master, like very famous architect you have in mind as inspiration?
Not really, actually. I don't have one architect, like one master. It's really like contamination, let's say, from many. So it's not even non-architects, like all the scientists, neuroscientists, biologists, or I always wanted to be an archaeologist, for example, but it's a field that inspires me, and genetic also, medicine. But I wouldn't just pick one architect, one maestro. Maybe it's not a patriarchal way of thinking.
Okay, thank you.
May I give a question, Sarah?
Yeah, of course.
Now, in the website, well, in the last slide by Lina, there was the website address. It's very interesting because it's very complex website, and there is a small text by Christine Blanchet, who is an art historian and French journalist, and describing Lina's work. She wrote, well, she's a humanist. I mean, you are a humanist. What does it mean, humanist, in your view, according to your path, your process?
I don't know, actually. It was very intriguing and still intriguing for me, the humanist side. And it's funny because sometimes also, like I lectured in Canada, and they called me the humanist architect. So I didn't understand what that exactly means. But I think it's like, personally, if I have to think like what drives me to make architecture is this like capacity of empathy too, like to make an architecture where people feel good, really, like that is really about human comfort, human warmth in a place. And the capacity also of an architecture to have its, it has its character, but it has also a strong capacity to almost disappear, dismantle in its environment, to just dilute in a way that it becomes one with its context, and brings on this new poetics, which is just really bringing from the environment, from the living environment, as humans, but also maybe as living creatures. What would be your interpretation, Michele, of humanism?
Okay, I was impressed when you have presented your diagram schemes in the first slides of your presentation. and by one side was nature, and by the other one is human. Okay, so it's like to imagine not a fight, but a sort of a contrast between what is human, and so maybe what is humanistic culture and what is nature. But at the end, your project are working about a strong integration and maybe hybridization between these two aspects. And so I guess it is maybe your humanistic approach is the idea of maybe you have said something about during the presentation, looking always for the human scale between among the spaces among the new spaces you are designing.
Mm.
Do you agree?
Yeah, no, totally. There is this human scale, the fact that moving from even if it's monumental to the human side, but it's also when designing, I always project myself as being a normal user or a normal person, actually, not an architect, who's gonna be in these spaces. I always become someone who's there actually to experience these spaces rather than just the eye of the architect, and that capacity also of feeling what would make someone comfortable in a place, and being able to hear actually the client or the city or the person that you're building for, and that also becomes much more an integrative process, even if it's orchestrated by a very strong idea that I would have for a project, but it allows itself to to disintegrate and to include, to be more inclusive.
I have other two questions from two participants. One is Laura. She says your lecture was very inspiring to her. She really liked the concept of reconnection to earth and the ground, nature and food that you try to apply, especially in material choices. How, in your opinion, this relation can be emphasized also through space and shapes design?
I mean, there is a sense of organicity in nature, like in the way we live. Like when we go, for example, to a walk in a forest, there is a sense of fractality, but also organicity, of multiplicity. And I think it's important that we see back this multiplicity, this complexity of shapes, of textures, of material in architecture, and that brings new shapes, new forms, new unboxed, let's say, architecture. And maybe this is where nature brings in a new language in architecture. Not because I'm always questioning the notion of biomimetism. It's not about mimicking architect like nature by creating like complex shapes. It's really learning from what nature has to tell us in terms of its capacity to be a living organism that is always ecosystemic, that is based on a circular economy, and how we can apply that in architecture, but also understanding from nature what it gives us as emotions when we experience a natural beauty, and how can we bring these emotions back into architecture as well and what we create.
Okay. Then the last question by Riccardo. You say that your building was a monster shaped by city regulation in Beirut, but it does not look like one of the regular monster that scares me. Can you please tell us a little bit more about the creative regulation process?
He means the building regulation, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. But also, I think it's a bit about the process that drove you to. But I think you explained it quite
Yeah.
Like how probably what he means is how can you fight a regulation when the design idea behind your project is so strong and
yeah. I mean, for example, when I had this lot, like in the city, it's a very like a narrow and long lot, and the building regulations give you two choices. Either you just occupy the whole lot, and then your building is lower, and then it gets hit by all the like prospect lines, and because you have to go on a 45 angles for bringing the light on the street, but doesn't really help. But anyway, you have to do it. Or you have to reduce your footprint and go higher in the height of the building. So here, maybe I wanted to go for this like more difficult part, is really bringing the whole, like occupying the whole site, embracing the the buildings close by, and then getting hit by all the prospect lines and seeing what happens. So it was also this like desire of going into the unexplored territory of not going to what has been done already with the towers, and seeing, okay, what can this actually generate in terms of relationship with the neighbors? How can it become more integrative, actually a bit more modest in terms of its height? And then, of course, in terms of regulation, or at least in practice, in Beirut, you would see that all the buildings are, a lot of the contemporary buildings are like skyscrapers with balconies, with glass all the way, because you have this kind of projections. So here, instead of having the balconies, which were prompt to become glassed, because this is the practice of the local practice, like I decided instead to avoid that problem of glassing the balcony, is to have inner balconies, to have like loggias actually that bring nature inside. At the same time, it's a reflection of the way I perceived the city. So it countered, like, it's really like a kind of negotiation with what exists, what you take as a position in relationship to a practice that has generated a certain language in the city, and generate something like that speaks or takes a critique on its environment in that sense.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think that's it for tonight. I think Michele wants to say some final greetings, but thank you again for your lecture and answers. It was very interesting to talk with you.
Thanks to Lina, thanks to Sarah, and thanks all to participants. I guess also tonight we had a very interesting in-depth examination of a part of our architectural culture in this particular moment. I hope Lina had a good experience with us, with Polytechnical, with this type of virtual lecture.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to share with you this, my first like virtual lecture, so I will remember it. And I have to say it's different, because normally I move and I talk, and it's like very static. So I hope it was clear for everyone, and I really hope to meet you all, because it's still very much needed.
Okay, thank you very much, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
everyone.